Hello and welcome to today's online discussion for developing an implementation plan for You Collect, We Buy, capitalizing on the gas capture opportunity. My name is Dave Keating. I'm coming at you live from the Euractiv studios in the heart of the EU quarter, and I'm going to be guiding us through today's discussion. Now, we all know that greenhouse gas emissions, some of them we can easily identify. We can see the CO2 coming out of car exhaust pipes. We can easily kind of understand how our home heating will contribute to greenhouse gases worldwide. But some of the emissions that cause climate change are harder to see. Methane is actually the second most important greenhouse gas contributor to climate change, following carbon dioxide. And in fact, methane's ability to trap heat in the atmosphere is even stronger than that of carbon dioxide. On a 100-year timescale, it has 28 times greater global warming potential than carbon dioxide and is 84 times more potent on a 20-year timescale. And one of the biggest sources of methane emissions in the world is leakage from gas wells, which escapes into the atmosphere during the process of extraction. Gas venting, flaring, and leakage accounts for tremendous wastage. It's not only damaging to the climate, but it's also literally throwing money out the window. An estimated 267 billion cubic meters of natural gas could be made available to gas markets with a global effort to reduce methane emissions and tackle non-emergency flaring. These volumes amount to over 70% of the EU's annual gas consumption, which was estimated at 360 BCM in 2023. That could be worth $48 billion. So it seems like a no-brainer. But it's not happening. Companies are not actually capturing the escaping gas and monetizing it right now. And it's surprising, given that this wasteful practice harms not only the environment due to the heat-trapping potential of methane, but also the health of local communities in the vicinity of the gas extraction. And conversely, if this gas was captured instead of wasted into the atmosphere, it would produce revenues for producers, it would produce energy security for purchasers, and it would help to slow near-term global warming. Unfortunately, this major opportunity isn't really on the radar of companies, or banks, or governments. And there are several reasons for this. It's in part due to poor data on flaring and emissions. The problem is we don't have an entire handle on where these leakages are. It's also due to the lack of internal incentives to prioritize the reduction of flaring. And it's also due to high competition for other company priorities. This is a tricky area, and sometimes companies can see it as not low-hanging fruit, but actually extremely high-hanging fruit. Even when gas recovery projects are identified, project development can be expensive and risky, and the economic feasibility can be hampered by tax regimes, expensive borrowing costs, and poor visibility on upstream demand for abated gas. So in today's discussion, we've brought together stakeholders and policymakers to discuss a new white paper from the Clean Air Task Force, which illustrates how the EU's You Collect, We Buy initiative could be shaped to capture and market gas that would have been leaked, vented, or flared otherwise. This all comes ahead of the EU's anticipated engagement at COP29, the climate summit coming up in Baku, Azerbaijan, on methane emissions in the energy sector. We know that the EU has prioritized this for international talks, so we'll consider how to build the necessary engagement, coordination, and partnerships globally to capitalize on these opportunities and create economic, energy, and climate benefits for all. Now, during today's event, you at home will be able to ask your questions to the panelists using the Slido feature. If you already know what you'd like to ask, you can go ahead and put those questions in now or throughout the online event. I'll be reading out your questions to the panelists at the end of this discussion. So, to get us started, I would like to hand over the floor for some opening remarks to Jonathan Banks, Global Director for Methane at the Clean Air Task Force. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Dave. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak today, and appreciate you all hosting this event. Um, CATF, for those of you who don't know, is a environmental NGO with staff working around the world. We have staff on 5 continents and projects on 6. We've been working on methane emissions since the early 2000s, when the science of methane first started to emerge as a major super pollutant in climate. The oil and gas sector has been a tremendous focus of our efforts, and it's our methane program is our largest program within the organization. But we also work on other energy and climate issues as well, with scientists, engineers, policy experts. We bring a unique perspective and complete perspective to the issue of trying to tackle methane emissions. In Europe specifically, we've been working on methane for many years, long before the methane regulation was even a concept, and really excited to see both the culmination of the methane regulations as well as the efforts to implement them going forward. Next slide. Yeah, that one. There you go. So Dave teed this up already quite well, but let me just say a little bit more on why such a focus on methane emissions. As Dave mentioned, methane is a very powerful super pollutant when it comes to climate. Over the course of 20 years, it's over 80 times more powerful than CO2, but the 20-year piece is a critical piece. Methane only stays in the atmosphere for a couple of decades, and then it is gone. Its impact is gone. And the beauty of that is that if we reduce methane emissions, we can actually have a dramatic impact on climate change in our lifetimes. So by cutting methane, we can slow climate change in our lifetime. It's the other reason we focus on methane emissions is that these emissions, as Dave mentioned, they are the low-hanging fruit in climate change. Climate is often a very difficult issue to tackle, but in the world of methane, and especially the world of methane and oil and gas, emissions are really the easiest thing to tackle that we have. 77% of emissions in the oil and gas sector can be cut with technologies that exist today. We don't have to create some newfangled technology. We can do them with, we can do the reductions that we need with technologies we have today. And 52% of those can be cut at either low or no cost. Next slide. This has led to a lot of attention recently on methane emissions. Back at COP26, the Global Methane Pledge was launched, which is 155 countries coming together to pledge to reduce their emissions by 30% by 2030. Following that, the EU's methane regulations, which were finalized relatively recently, are really the first efforts by the EU to try to tackle methane in the oil and gas sector. But uniquely, they include a special aspect, which is the first of its kind globally, which is to try to tackle methane emissions outside of the borders of the EU. And this is because the EU imports so much oil and gas into the Union. Now, despite all of this, we are not seeing the progress that we need to see in reducing methane emissions and reducing flaring, which is the waste of gas through burning at oil and gas sites. You can see on the chart on the right there, you can see total flaring volumes as well as flaring intensity. And while flaring intensity has gone down a little, we're not seeing the kinds of progress that we need to see, and so much more needs to be done. Next slide. At COP28, following the onset of the conflict in Ukraine, President von der Leyen announced a novel approach to trying to tackle this problem, trying to incentivize the solution to this problem, with a program that was dubbed "You Collect, We Buy." The idea was to take all of this wasted gas, and rather than it going to the atmosphere either as methane or as burned off as CO2, collect that gas and put it to a beneficial use. The the wasted gas is, as Dave mentioned, is worth millions of dollars. And this concept of collecting that to provide some sort of energy security as well as environmental benefit was a relatively new concept. Now, it sounds relatively simple. You collect, we buy. But in practice, it is much, much more difficult to actually achieve this. In June, we brought together experts from national oil companies, international oil companies, other industry stakeholders, financial institutions, civil society organizations, all together to sit down and talk through what is blocking these projects from moving forward. Why isn't this happening? If it's economic, if it's got these huge environmental benefits, why isn't this stuff happening? And as Dave mentioned, we are launching a white paper today that brings together all of the learnings from those conversations that we had with all of the stakeholders to lay out a pathway forward for how you could actually go about implementing You Collect, We Buy. Next slide. So just a little bit more. Again, Dave teed this up a little bit, so I'll skip through this relatively quickly. We're looking at $48 billion in lost revenue every year, and 267 billion cubic meters of gas, which is, again, about 70% of EU's annual consumption. Most of this is coming from flares, smaller volumes coming from venting and leaking, but all of this could potentially be captured and brought to a beneficial use. So with all of that money and all of these environmental impacts, why again isn't this happening? There are systemic barriers that exist within the system that are blocking all of this from happening, and that's really what we tried to get into at the workshop that we brought together in June. Next slide. Now, I'm vastly oversimplifying this here, and we'll go into more detail in a little while with the panels. But I wanted to just, at a high level, hit a few things that try to break down the problems that we're seeing and that stakeholders are identifying in this space. And these things come down to four key elements: coordination, financing, commercialization, and prioritization. On coordination, I'll give you an example. In an oil and gas field, you can have one partner that's controlling the oil, one partner that's controlling the gas, and the partner that's controlling the oil, when they discover gas along with their oil, may not have access to the gas infrastructure or the gas processing facilities. They may not even own that gas, and so there's no incentive to invest in a project. And then sometimes several fields in proximity have to pool their flare gas volumes in order to make a potential project profitable. This requires a tremendous amount of cooperation and collaboration. And if everyone's not aligned, the project will never happen. On prioritization, employees running operations at these facilities, they've got a lot on their plates, and meeting production and revenue targets is usually their top priority. Similarly, if top management in the company has an opportunity to invest in a project, say a gas capture project that would deliver 400 million or so in profit, if there's another project on the table to drill a new well for $800 million profit, you can guess where they're going to put their money. On the financing side, there are many oil and gas companies that have no need whatsoever for finance. It's not a problem. But in lower and middle income countries, getting inexpensive capital can be really challenging, especially because a lot of the multilateral development banks are moving away from upstream oil and gas investments. And then on commercialization, while there's a commercial value and tremendous environmental attributes of these projects, right now there's really no market and no verified certification scheme to actually place that value on these things. Next slide. And as Dave mentioned, data is exacerbating all of these problems. On the coordination side of things, often Partners aren't even aware of all of the available opportunities in these fields. Companies in prioritization, companies confidently don't know where they're going, where they should be investing, which projects make the most sense, and which ones have the most potential returns. In the financing side of things, banks and carbon markets aren't confident in the emissions reductions and the climate benefits, and therefore don't invest. And then on the commercialization side of thing, downstream buyers have no confidence right now in these emission reductions or the origins of the gas that might be feeding into those emissions reductions. Next slide. But one of our key takeaways from this work is that due to the interconnected nature of all of these challenges, unlocking these barriers can't be done unilaterally or even bilaterally. What we need to see is coordinated action from a much broader range of stakeholders to make this work. And this is where You Collect, We Buy could play a pivotal role in mobilizing and coordinating engagement. Next slide. If we had to kind of boil this down to kind of really three next steps, the first would be that we really need to build momentum and political buy-in from governments, companies, and financial institutions to show that this is a win-win solution, that tackling these negative perceptions around investing in gas recovery projects and in demonstrating these irrefutable climate impacts of these investments is absolutely critical. Second, we really need to establish a coordination framework where interested governments, companies, financial institutions, and NGOs can signal their interest to participate in these kinds of projects that can really bring strong deliverables and actions. And then third, we need to focus on developing the parameters for data-driven criteria such as robust monitoring, reporting, and verification that can be used for projects to qualify for certification and innovative financing. And this will play a key role in driving companies to invest in these projects. Now, the rest of the session today will go through in much greater detail in these things than I have, and so I'm looking forward to hearing the next two panels talk about this. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. As you say, I think you did a good job there of outlining that this is low-hanging fruit in terms of emissions reduction potential, but the context, the circumstances is actually making this high-hanging fruit for the companies because of all of those various factors you mentioned. So the way we're going to do our discussion today, as we discuss the paper and the overall situation, we've divided it into two panels. On the first panel, we're going to be talking about the barriers to development of the actual gas capture projects, and then leakage capture projects. And then in the second panel, we're going to be talking about the barriers to developing the market for how you would actually sell the captured leakages in a way that can actually make profit for companies and which would incentivize the companies to invest in the projects. So let's start with panel one now. In this panel, we're going to set the scene and explore how to remove those barriers to developing and identifying the gas capture projects. And one of those, as Jonathan mentioned, is the data. Where do you put the projects? Where is the methane actually escaping? And then after this discussion, we hope that the audience will have a better understanding of the main reasons why gas capture projects aren't being developed right now and how stakeholders need to collaborate to change this. So let me introduce you now to our panelists. We have here with us today Alexander Vinya, who is a policy officer at the European Commission's Energy Department. We have Ebelechukwu Chiatula, lead for renewable energies research at the Nigerian National Petroleum Company. And we have Mark Davis, CEO of Capterio, project developers who are monetizing wasted gas. Thank you so much to all three of you for joining us today. So when we look at the facts here, we know that the opportunity sounds impressive on paper, but is it in practice? Mark, you have significant background developing gas capture projects. So from your experience, what are the key issues blocking this development, and what are the key issues that companies encounter when they're trying to do this?
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, Jonathan, for your introduction. And it's great to see the white paper out today. Dave, as you mentioned, we are a Flare Solutions company. There's such a large opportunity here to make a difference. And as Jonathan said rightly, it is a low-hanging fruit, and it's one of the key enablers that we can pull to reduce emissions and to accelerate the energy transition. So I think it's important to note that one of the challenges we face is there's a lack of financeable projects coming to the table. I hear this when I speak to financing organizations, financing groups. And there's a bit of a sense of frustration that they would like to make progress, but there are not enough projects coming to the table. And if you unpick what's behind that, it's because projects to be financed, they need to be technically and commercially mature. That means that there's a lot of technical and commercial work that has to be done before they can be, taken to a decision point. And that technical work is not being done, and that commercial work's not being done for a variety of reasons. And really, to solve this, we need to fix that problem. So let's unpick what's going on here. Well, firstly, as I think both of you said, one of the biggest challenges is that we don't necessarily have full alignment as to where the biggest opportunities are. There's a bit of a data gap, both on the methane side and on the flaring side, which means that flaring is not sufficiently on the radar of senior executives. Now, whilst many leading oil and gas companies are already driving the right and the best practices, for some of their non-operated assets or for some assets where national oil companies are dominant, this is a bit of a black box, a bit of an unknown quantity. And in fact, flaring and methane is not necessarily well known. It's often not metered or measured. Sometimes it's not reported. Sometimes even denied. So the first barrier that we need to overcome is this sort of not on the radar, lack of visibility gap. And that's really also where our leadership comes in. The second gap that I think that Jonathan's alluded to, that we see a lot, is there's a perception that projects don't make money and therefore they are not intrinsically attractive enough to be investable. Now, in my experience, this is not the case. In fact, the IEA has done a lot of work on this to say that, I think Jonathan quoted the number, 77% of all projects have a negative net cost. They are attractive. But I think what's interesting here is that we need to be creative about how we think about structuring projects, how we think about delivering them in an agile and specialist way so that we can bring the cost down and compress the timelines and actually make them go forward. But the third reason that we often see that slowing down these projects coming to technical and commercial maturity is a lack of willingness to be financed. And I hear this so often. I hear the refrain, well, these are projects that are fossil fuels. In the fossil fuel industry, we don't want to fund them. And to those who say that, I would make a plea. I would say, please can we reframe these not as fossil fuel projects, but as carbon and methane and CO2 abatement projects, because they do need to be financed. We do need to find ways to bring capital. And unless we bring capital to the market, we are not going to solve this really critical issue. So I think net, there's such a lot of opportunity. The scale is enormous. Jonathan said it right, 267 billion cubic meters. That's an enormous amount of value being left on the table. And by working together collaboratively across many stakeholder boundaries, we can together reduce the emissions, we can create value, we can improve energy security, and we can accelerate the energy transition. Thank you.
Thanks, Mark. Ebele, let's turn to you next. We know Nigeria is a big gas extraction country, and it's made important efforts to reduce flaring and methane emissions. So from the perspective of an NOC, we heard from Mark there that sometimes knowing where these flares take place can be difficult. Making the justification for the investment can be difficult. What are some of the most important solutions to building internal momentum for these projects within an NOC? And what solutions should be considered to address these operational challenges?
Thank you very much, Dave. As Mark rightly put it, there is a lot of stakeholders involved, especially when we look at them internally. The contracts, like you say, some of them say, the NOCs will own the gas and then you just operate the facility. And then you have financial middlemen in some cases, and you still have operational middlemen in some other cases. So bringing all those people to the table and getting them to agree, is usually where the problem starts from, because everyone has different interests, and like you said, everyone is trying to turn a profit on their own investment. So I believe taking everybody in from the start is really important. Letting everyone know that when we win at this, we win together. The facility is improved, the asset has more value, and then, like you said, we could have access to more innovative financing if we can prove that we are actually having a flare down with these operations. So while we have those internal issues, we also have, will I say, leadership. So for most of the countries in sub-Saharan Africa, especially between last year and this year, you would see that there has been a lot of leadership changes, elections, and for us, it usually takes a toll on our operations because there are new directives, there are new directions, there are new interests. So we sort of have to wait till all of that settles. And as Mark has said, having shorter time delivery time on those projects is also important, because if they span across too long, then you might have interference from either socioeconomic issues or leadership or change in government, or like we've had this year, we've had severe energy security challenges, and that has led to massive price changes in a lot of things, especially our fuel pump price. So some of those things has affected the way or the direction we've taken internally as to what we prioritize. So that would mean that, flare down projects might no longer be on the top of their list, and then getting people to meet, discuss, or even take a decision on what to do next and how to go about that it's it's a bit of a challenge. Even just speaking to my colleagues before this workshop and before the session, getting them to have that meeting. We kept having missed meetings, and then, they said, yeah, they're interested and it's something they could do, but they have other things on the table, and it has not really proven to be profitable. So it's the same story we're still hearing. So getting them to sit down and discuss this really early with the right data. I think that's what Mark put it, with the right data is pretty important. I'm so happy that the white paper is coming out just before COP. I know a lot of my colleagues will be there, and part of my leadership will be there, and it will be good for them to know what the EU is thinking as regards supporting methane emissions outside of Europe, because that will help them, look forward to taking decisions in that light. I think that's what I have to contribute. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. So, Alexander, we've heard there some of the business factors involved here, and obviously, if this is going to happen, it's going to require buy-in and engagement from a broad range of stakeholders. That includes governments, it includes oil and gas companies, it also includes financial institutions. So from the perspective of the European Commission, I mentioned that the EU has identified this as something of a priority in international talks. How can the European Commission help build this engagement through this You Collect, We Buy initiative? And what are the next steps that the European Commission is going to take?
Yep, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you very much to the Cleaner Task Force for inviting us and for the great exchanges we had so far already. Let me underline really the importance of this white paper being issued, because it does a fantastic job in being at the same time comprehensive and short and to the point. So Jonathan had a slide with those dots in different shades of blue, which I think reflects very well the high number of different actors that have to come together with their different responsibilities and capabilities to help advance the You Collect, We Buy initiative as a whole. So building a momentum for abatement projects, I think, calls, among others, for finding interested buyers. So this in turn would trigger appetite from oil and gas companies to do the right thing. So focusing on the demand side, I think, will be one of the elements I want to highlight today. But let me just start by a short reference to the EU methane regulation that is now in force and will start gradually bearing fruits. It is a powerful instrument, but it is rather a stick. So one could argue for having also a carrot to incentivize people to do the right thing, and we believe that Collect, We Buy could be that. Another piece of legislation that came into force recently in the EU is the so-called decarbonized gases package, and this package gives us and the Commission a legal basis for putting in place a gas mechanism. We used to have, and we still have, the Aggregate EU platform, the demand aggregation and joint purchasing platform that was put in place in 2023, which is a crisis instrument. So now we're moving into something else, I think. So we are finalizing now the process of selecting service providers who will have a company working with us. And we'll be working on a modular IT platform. I mean, it's maybe not fundamental here, but this will be a broader thing. But among the different energy carriers or commodities we'll work on, we will work on so-called fossil gas. We're clearly of the view that the carbon footprint of this gas needs to be addressed in such a mechanism, and this is where possibly this is the tool on which we could build also an instrument for Collect, We Buy. So as you probably know, everybody knows, we're in a transition phase. We'll have new leadership coming into place, so they will guide us in this respect. But we believe that a matching platform for companies producing gas and buyers interested in buying gas with a lower footprint could be a valuable proposition. So this is all subject to discussions, I think, also with stakeholders, and this is why I insisted right from the beginning that we very much appreciate the dialogue we had so far, but we also want to continue it. We need feedback from all parties involved to see whether this could actually be an appropriate tool. So the tool, as I said, would in particular allow us to identify the demand and the appetite from European buyers for gas with a lower emissions footprint, and I think that's really the essential element of it. Let me also move on to another aspect. We heard a reference in the introduction from Dave already to the upcoming COP. So the Commission is very much engaged in international cooperation when it comes to methane. On the 6th of October, we signed another initiative, an LNG Importers Initiative, Alliance for Methane Mitigation from the LNG Value Chain, together with Japan. It was done building on a commitment already from the previous year at the LNG Producer Consumers Conference that Japan organizes yearly. So this highlights the importance of having a common understanding between the different important or large gas importers, that we would work along the same principles when it comes to monitoring, reporting, verification, the use of OGMP 2.0 by companies, that we would build on the existing and available expertise of the IEA, of the International Methane Emissions Observatory, and so on. So by having a common approach, having a common front, I think we can also improve this demand visibility for companies that may want to produce gas in a cleaner manner. Coming to the COP and to multilateral engagements, indeed, at COP28, our President Ursula von der Leyen spearheaded the signature of the Global Methane Pledge. So for this year, we're planning a methane abatement partnership roadmap. The President announced the roadmap, so here it is. More details to come, obviously, in Baku, but the logic of this roadmap would be to support cooperation between importing and exporting countries by putting in place a common framework to support projects. So again, it is to build on the multitude of existing tools, instruments, and resources. Again, as I said, the IMO, IEA, and different other stakeholders, of course, and to to produce adaptable solutions, ideas that can very quickly be moved from one place to another, sort of best practices, if you wish, in a step-by-step manner. So by which, as I said, incentivize cooperation between importers and exporters. Voilà. So this will be announced during the leadership segment of the upcoming COP. So please stay tuned for that.
Great. Thanks, Alexander. So before I go to the questions from the audience, I just want to go back to Mark. So we've just heard from Alexander, there's some of the next steps from the Commission. From your perspective, what would be most helpful from policymakers in terms of making this actually happen and go from a discussion point to a tangible reality?
Yes, well, thank you, and a good question. And let me just say, I think this leadership we're seeing from the EU is fantastic, and it really is driving a connection between the suppliers and the buyers, and it's really enforcing a sense of shared responsibility across the supply chain, which is so important. I think really to drive this faster, as you've indicated, we do need to have transparency around the standards and the data, and the ability to differentiate products. We also need to understand the enforcement mechanisms and how they would apply. But I think net, it really is a big leap forward that really aligns the incentives and should be working in the self-interest of the suppliers as well, because they will increasingly realize that they need to compete in an increasingly challenging market where the bar is being raised each and every year.
Let me put to you guys a question that's come in from the audience. Abele, I'll put this to you first. So the question is from Leah Pilsner. This feels like primarily an industry internal matter rather than a regulatory matter for EU institutions. How would you say You Collect, We Buy compares to creating leverage through a buyer's coalition? Thank you. So Abele, let's put that to you first. Do you think that the momentum here should be coming from the private sector or from the public sector? And what do you think about this idea of a buyer's coalition?
Well, I would say, like we've discussed, if you leave it to be an internal matter, it's going to take a really long time for businesses to have that momentum. They do need that push from the outside because that priority is not really there. And like you've mentioned, we have associated gas and non-associated gas well development. And for some countries, especially like ours, that are struggling with energy security, non-associated gas well development now is where the focus will be. Not a lot of operators will be willing to, invest in associated gas flare down or any sort of investment. They just want their money out as quickly as possible because they can see the future in non-associated gas. So if we don't have that push from the outside, from the buyers saying, okay, we want this, there's a demand, the market wants this, then, the commercial value for them is not just there. They don't have enough incentive to move. They just keep talking about it. They keep, pitching about, the good it can do, but they probably not make a decision as quick as we imagine it to be. But once there's a market for it, I think we're going to see momentum. And one of the ways we can see that is if we, like you've said, we do those measurements, we have a pilot to say and demonstrate that this is the kind of value you can get. And once that demonstration is done and the buyers are interested and have committed, then it's just going to be like a domino. Everyone is just going to want to have their hand in the pot. That's how I see it.
Jonathan, if I could bring you in here, I'd love to get your perspective on this. In terms of the report, did you compare the possibility of a buyer's coalition versus a public sector scheme like You Collect, We Buy?
We didn't really look at a direct comparison along those lines. I think the important thing to note here is that this does not exist in isolation. This is not the only thing that's trying to address methane emissions, and it's not the only European Union thing trying to address methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. You Collect, We Buy works in conjunction with the European Union's regulations to address both domestic methane emissions as well as imported methane emissions. And so You Collect, We Buy can serve as a way to help pave the path for many countries to economically capture these projects and reduce their emissions, and use this as a form of incentivizing action. If we simply leave all of this to the private sector, and this is not a dig on the private sector at all, but if we simply leave it to the private sector, this won't happen. If you look at, we talked about this earlier, if you look at within a company, there is internal competition for available capital. And if I'm investing in a flare gas capture project that has a certain profit margin, or an abatement project of methane leaks that has a certain profit margin, but someone else in the company is drilling a new well that has a much higher profit margin, they're going to get the available capital. These kinds of programs like You Collect, We Buy, working in conjunction with the EU import standard, can provide the kind of structure that drives those decisions to actually incentivize the capture of the gas and the reduction of the emissions to the atmosphere.
Well, Alexander, I want to put this question to you as well about the benefits of having a public sector approach. And I'll put another question to you, Alexander, that's come in from the audience. This one is from Eddie Van Bowel. The question is, will consumers of lower carbon fossil gas be able to get credit for this lower footprint, as in regulations such as as Fuel EU Maritime? That would create another strong incentive for reducing well-to-tank footprints to the extent possible. So first question, the Buyers Coalition idea. Second question, could consumers of lower footprint fuels get a credit?
Yes, well noted. Thank you very much. So on the first aspect, let's be clear. The methane regulation is a heavy instrument. It will come in force progressively with very clear deadlines to comply. And we believe that some oil and gas producing countries may need some help. So we think that engaging with them earlier, with the support of all the people who you hear and you will hear today, this could help actually those countries to comply. So we're not only coming with a heavy-handed intervention, we're also trying to provide support. So what I kind of dislike maybe is in the semantics of the Buyers Coalition, that it sounds like as if it was something that would happen at the expense of producers. And let's be very clear on this. It says we buy, but we know that there are countries around the world, like Nigeria, which have immense energy needs. So it cannot come as us versus them. Absolutely not. So that's why I prefer a more collaborative name than a buyers club, even though the intention is of course right to improve the standards. What are the benefits? So indeed, to my knowledge, there would be absolutely no recognition under initiatives such as Maritime EU. That's a problem. I think anything related to gas, to fossil gas, is treated by many investors, and therefore, in many pieces of legislation as something fossil, harmful, and so on, and therefore would not be receiving recognition, even though it should, in my view, because it is clearly improving the overall carbon footprint of a fuel. So I think this is one of the topics where we need to discuss more. There are some possible avenues when it comes to corporate sustainability reporting, for instance, but this is not set in stone. So I think there is a need for the different stakeholders to get involved and to identify those places where people doing the right thing could or should be getting the benefit of their actions. So if I can use this opportunity, please come to us and talk. So that's important.
Great. Well, we'll wrap up panel one there. Thank you to all of you for giving us your insights there. We'll now move on to panel two, where we're going to be talking about some of the barriers to developing the market for this captured gas and what's standing in the way of actually being able to develop a market for this. We touched upon this a bit in panel one in terms of the idea of a buyer's coalition. So how do you actually get the financing there? How do you develop this market? And in particular, we're going to be focusing on the financial and marketing barriers. And we hope that after this discussion, the audience will be able to understand which actions partner governments, financial institutions, and downstream importers could take to actually make this happen within the framework of the methane partnerships that we touched upon in the first panel. So let me introduce you now to our panelists. We have with us here today Martin Oswald, a senior gas expert with the World Bank. We have Brandon Locke, Europe Policy Manager for Methane at the Clean Air Task Force. We have Miriam Hamani, Global Methane Policy and Advocacy Lead at Shell. And we have George Taibosh, CEO of MIQ, which is a climate tech not-for-profit working to reduce methane emissions in the oil and gas sector. Thank you to all four of you for joining us here today. Martin, let me start with a question for you. The World Bank has really been on the forefront of global efforts to reduce flaring, notably through the Zero Routine Flaring Initiative by 2030, and also the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership. So in the last panel, we touched on some of the challenges for mobilizing financing and technical capacity. Could you share how your work at the World Bank through the GFRM is working to address some of those issues? And also, based on your experience, what additional steps would really make a difference for accelerating progress in order to make GFRM and also the You Collect, We Buy collaborate in terms of ensuring that these steps are taken?
Wonderful. Thank you very much, and thanks for having me at this panel. Maybe first let me briefly introduce the GFMR partnership, so the Global Flaring and Methane Reduction Partnership, which was inaugurated at COP last year in Dubai, and which has as partners major IOCs such as Shell, Miriam is here, BP, Equinor, also other players from the Middle East, and of course also major governments such as the US or Germany, for example. So what we originate actually from, or originate is not the right word. We are the logical extension from a previous trust fund that was hosted within the World Bank, the GGFR Trust Fund, so the Global Gas Flaring Reduction Trust Fund, which had been in existence since the early 2000s, and which was, apart from a few project initiatives, mainly active in the knowledge and awareness, on the knowledge and awareness side. So the Global Flaring Tracker was mentioned today. That's one of our products. The Global Gas Flaring Regulation Overview it's an online tool actually that I invite you to take a look at. Is something that we're also very proud of. And through these engagements, we built a fair amount of credibility within the industry. And then, of course, once we decided to include methane in the scope and to go bigger, this was a great argument to convince our sponsors and our donors to work together with us and contribute to the trust fund. So this long history that we've built up in a very close related manner, of course, was very, very helpful in that regard. Of course, other items that helped is that even though financing of oil and gas in the upstream is something that the World Bank since 2019 is no longer considering, but what does help is that the World Bank has the capability to raise financing in other areas. So, for example, we've worked quite a bit under the umbrella of related financing programs within the World Bank to introduce flaring and venting regulations in a number of countries. That did help, this broader umbrella effect that is there. And of course, the World Bank is also not only a financial bank, it's also a knowledge bank. So we produce knowledge products, and at a high credibility level. And of course, we also have the capability and the reach to disseminate them to the right audience. So that, of course, also helped in convincing our donors to work with us as partners. Now, how we plan to responsibly use these funds that we've been entrusted with is that we are looking for a number of factors. So, of course, at the beginning, the projects that we are supporting, we are focusing on ELDA, leak detection and repair, with arguably a slight focus on the repair side. So we, of course, in a first instance, focus on the materiality of the emission volumes that we try to abate. Other elements that we also look at are those projects that are they replicable in the country? So in other words, can they be copied in multiple instances? And of course, we also look at capacity building aspects. So if we decide to engage with a project partner, will this engagement also lead to the sort of capacity that helps them to carry out similar projects without our help in the future? So overall, what we are aiming at, apart from the materiality aspect, is to initiate something in a country. So to create a dynamic so that once emission abatement projects are, or this whole initiative has been kicked off, is there some sort of autodynamic where the country will continue working on this without our direct support? So we see ourselves very much as initiators, as seed financiers of these sort of capabilities. But of course, even though our trust fund is very substantial, we can only contribute part of to the overall story. So all the other partners that are here on the call today and beyond, we all have to work together and bring our various levers and capabilities at play to make sure that we really address this this issue in a comprehensive manner and lead to results.
Thanks, Martin. Brandon, let's turn to you next. We heard from Jonathan at the beginning about how the white paper really identified that there wouldn't be a net cost to companies to do this. However, we still see the companies are not prioritizing gas capture projects. So how can financial institutions and governments change this dynamic? And in general, how can these projects be made more economically feasible?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Dave, and thanks again to all the participants for being here. I really do think that this is the million-dollar question that we've touched on a few times. You know, if there's profit here, why aren't the projects moving forward? And I think what we really need to look at is two types of projects. There's the projects that aren't economically feasible, where they're not considered because they would incur significant costs. And then I think there's another section of projects where they may be economically feasible, but other investment costs may have higher rates of return. And so that's where the cost of the project isn't so much the issue, so much as the opportunity cost for investing in another project. And I think what we essentially need to think about doing is increasing the economic feasibility of these projects by reducing their net costs and bankability. And in the white paper, we go through three different ways that we could go about doing this. And I'll just summarize them very quickly. The first is thinking about what can partner governments do to reduce these costs. And this can be done through positive or negative financial incentives. Positive incentives would be things like tax breaks, and negative incentives would be penalties or fees on methane emissions and flaring. And if you do either of those two things, you're going to reduce the net cost of a project. The second approach is really looking at scaling the usage of carbon credits and offsets for gas capture projects. And many carbon credit programs can already be leveraged for these types of projects. But I think there's a lot of challenges that we've seen in terms of marketing these credits coming from upstream oil and gas, and building confidence and trust in the quality and the integrity of these credits is really essential. And This is something that we think can be done, by building up those robust data standards, and also by building a link to the You Collect, We Buy initiative. And another potential pathway forward here is really building clarity on wider eligibility for gas capture projects in compliance markets, for example, such as ETS schemes, and this would really reduce the cost of projects dramatically because compliance markets they generally have higher carbon prices. The last solution I want to touch on, and this goes back to what others have mentioned already, is really reducing the cost of capital, and this goes back to what many have already touched on regarding financial institutions moving away from financing to upstream oil and gas because of legitimate concerns about alignment with the Paris Agreement, financing fossil fuel lock-in, reputational risk. And that means that the cost of the capital or the inability to access the capital can really be prohibitive to getting that project started. And so I think it's really going to be crucial for banks and their shareholders and other investors to really start to cultivate this understanding that under the right conditions, these projects do have that demonstrable impact to slow global warming. And I think building this understanding is really the next next step or the pathway that we would use to open up financing for these projects. And this can be done by creating exemptions for direct financing under those very clear conditions, such as that the project wouldn't lock in fossil fuel. We can look at increasing sovereign lending directly to governments with very clear objectives for reducing methane emissions. And the third option, which I think is the most innovative, is developing sustainability instruments, such as methane bonds, which can provide companies loans that would be tied to very clear company-wide methane reduction targets, where interest rates and capital costs are then tied to meeting those targets. So I think I should stop there. Just to recap, there's 3 different ways to reduce the net cost of the projects. Governments can leverage positive or negative incentives. 2, we can leverage carbon credits by building confidence in the credits themselves and expanding eligibility to compliance markets. And then 3, financial institutions and investors can provide that direct financing either through carve-outs or sovereign lending or sustainability instruments, which would ensure that they can put that money on the table without compromising those very important environmental and climate goals. So I'll stop there and hand back to you, Dave.
Thanks, Brandon. So Miriam, let's go to you next for the perspective of an oil and gas producer. So one of the selling points of the You Collect, We Buy initiative is the energy security angle, because the gas can be used domestically or exported. And so, for instance, it would give the EU more energy security. But we're also talking about producing a commodity that has commercially valuable environmental attributes. And currently, no market exists for this captured gas. What would you say are the most important steps for creating this market?
Thanks, Dave, and very happy to be here today to discuss this important topic. So to build and sustain a market for abated or low methane intensity, greenhouse gas intensity gas, requires availability of the abated gas, and this was covered by the previous panel. It requires incentives for buyers to participate in the market, a credible methodology to attest the abated gas emissions credentials, and a transparent platform to signal demand as well. So I'll go through these in a bit more detail one by one. In terms of incentives for buyers, these can range from corporate decarbonization targets to meeting shareholder expectations. Buyers can also be incentivized financially, for example, through tax breaks or policy mechanisms such as contract for difference. and also through regulations that set performance targets in the longer term, such as the EU methane regulations. It will be very important that price signals for abated gas emerge in a transparent manner for all market participants, as this will help suppliers respond to demand based on a clear understanding of customer willingness to pay. On ensuring data robustness and credibility, robust certification schemes that can set transparent eligibility criteria, baselines, and verification processes can help with building trust in the abated gas emissions credentials and ensuring that the abated gas volumes meet specific criteria and are not double counted. Success will inevitably require gas producers to first commit to robust monitoring, reporting, and verification frameworks to create the foundation for credible emissions baselines and certificates. And demonstrating the effectiveness of the certification scheme through on-the-ground pilots will be essential in this process. Finally, the ability for buyers to signal demand, for example, through a gas procurement aggregation mechanism. Alexander mentioned earlier the EU scheme that may continue or not, as well as a potential willingness to commit to price premium, will all be key to building upstream engagement in gas capture project development. Hand over back to you, Dave.
Thanks a lot, Miriam. George, let's go to you next. So we talked a bit about how one of the problems is the lack of certification, right? So can you explain in a bit more detail why a certification scheme for abated gas would be important to scale gas capture projects? And how do you think it should be set up? What lessons can be learned from MIQ's experience in certifying natural gas, just normal natural gas?
Yeah, happy to pick that up. So maybe quickly give an intro to MIQ and what we do with certified gas, because it's actually quite a recent experience of what we've set up in the United States. And actually it's intended for global usage, but it started in the United States probably because the markets are slightly more complex from a gas perspective, but also more innovative. And now we are in more or less 2 years since the actual certification started. We are now certifying 240 BCM a year in the United States. And actually, since last week, we've also started to certify LNG facilities, starting with Grain LNG in the UK. And there's many lessons that we can take from that scheme. And when we devised that scheme, we already took a lot of the lessons from other schemes that are also similar. For example, in the electricity markets, there's various schemes. One of them is called REX, and in Europe, it's the version called GOs, Guarantees of Origin, which also uses certificate mechanisms. Now, the devil is often in the detail when one devises these schemes, because obviously electricity is very different than gas. Now talking about the existing MIQ certification scheme, and that will be different than if we come up with a scheme for dealing with allowing the abatement of flaring gas, where we'll have to devise another scheme for that. But there are definitely a couple of principles we believe that need to be followed. The first of them is that it's clear, it's really important that the scheme is independent of the industry, because obviously otherwise there is a potential conflict. And this might sound weird, but we have come across schemes that are developed by operators, and obviously that is not going to be trustworthy for the wider markets. A second one is, and it also sounds like an obvious one, a scheme needs to be transparent. If you take a look on our website, we have now more than 1,000 pages of protocols which we have published, because we look at the different parts of the supply chain. Again, there are initiatives out there where it's not very clear what is actually being certified, and that's key. And then we're now ending more on the methane specific part. And I think that's valid here as well, which is, let's just summarize it as MRV. And Miriam touched upon a couple of these ones, and so I'm not necessarily going to repeat that. But the credibility of the data, the use of auditors, including on the ground, is key as methane science and methane accounting is still a very complex field, but it's absolutely doable. But it needs to be robust and credible, and I think that's part of the reason why the market has grown. And I say this as a former trader in gas and electricity markets. If the commercial people or the traders don't see a robust market or a credible scheme, then over time it fizzles away. You need to have to build a market from zero is actually quite tough, and we're now starting with MIQ on the side of things of the buyers, and that leads to the next subject is the buyers. I do believe it is key that we get the buyers involved, and that's why I really applaud the role of the EU in leading this initiative, obviously being the biggest buyer of gas on a global scale. And that signal needs to be given, because otherwise, if we only start on the operator level, then a market can't exist if there's only one side of the equation and not the other side of the equation. And a lot of this is around chicken and egg, and both need to come to the table and grow together. But again, for both sides of the equation, the certification standards and the underlying mechanisms, and that includes a digital registry for tracking and tracing of the attributes in the gas, that needs to be credible. Otherwise, the market will not take off. And obviously, there are many pseudo markets that we see outside of fossil fuels now that have failed or are having trouble. So yeah, it's all about these key standards to make it work ultimately.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, that developing this market from scratch is really the difficulty here, right? Because you can always have this feeling of inertia when there's nothing there to start with. And so the chicken or the egg question is a very pertinent one. I want to take some questions from the audience now that have come in so far. Again, you can submit your questions via Slido, and I'll read them out to the panelists. So this is more about the global framework. So I'm going to put this to Martin first from the World Bank. So the question is, how do you see these EU efforts with You Collect, We Buy as being aligned with and contributing to the MMRV framework global initiative that the U.S. Department of Energy is currently leading? That's the Measurement, Monitoring, Reporting, and Verification framework. Martin, do you see these as being complementary? How might these different initiatives cooperate with each other on global level?
Okay, thank you very much for the question. So of course there's a clear complementarity there, but I would argue that the EU's methane regulation, of course, because it has or will have, I should rather say, a strong market component built in through the methane intensity element that will be elaborated more in the near future, as I understand it. So the EU's regulation goes further, but of course, and I think this has been said a couple of times already, the data part and then the monitoring reporting side is key to that. And in that sense, there is a clear complementarity between the two.
Brandon, I'd also like to get your thoughts on this.
Yeah, thanks. It's an excellent question, and I think it's worth going back to one of the key points that Jonathan raised at the beginning about how improving measurement-based data is just so critical to every step of this process, including the ones that George and Miriam just touched on. We need the data to build that awareness of the opportunities, to build the confidence and trust for investors and carbon credit markets, and for downstream buyers. And I think that building those MRV frameworks, it's something that companies and partner countries and CSOs need to work on together. But this is just another element of incentive to really start working on those MRV frameworks, and it coordinates very well, as Martin just said, with the incentives that the EU methane regulation has put on the table to really have some sort of MRV framework in place by 2027. So I think what we're looking at is a lot of complementary initiatives that really work together to push all the stakeholders towards those MRV frameworks, really for the benefit of every stakeholder in this supply chain, for producers, for importers, for consumers. We're all getting the benefit of this increased accountability and confidence in the data that's being reported.
George, I'd like to get your thoughts as well, especially when we're thinking about certification. How important is the collaboration between these initiatives going to be?
Yeah, and I think it's actually a really good question, because there are a lot of initiatives out there, of course. And in the context of this this webinar, I think what's key to point out is that we are discussing here specifically dealing with flaring emissions. And a lot of the MRV frameworks, and MIQ being one of them, is more generic on dealing with methane coming out of oil and gas. And so, for example, on the MIQ standards, we have specific requirements of how flaring is dealt with, but it's embedded in the MRV framework. And if operators deal with it on a higher level or more use best practices, then that's part of the scoring that they will receive, because ultimately we give a grading. But it's not explicit. And I think here in this webinar, what we're talking about is having an explicit system to create a market purely for non-flared gas, and which I think is a specific problem which goes almost slightly beyond purely the methane question. So I would say that there is, at the same time, differences, but also quite a logic in separating out flaring, because obviously flaring, by being flared, it creates CO2, which is less a problem, but then there's the methane leaks that are taking place anyway. So it's a separate dimension, I would argue. And from that perspective, setting up a certification framework for, let's say, flaring or non-flaring rather, is going to require some of the MRV elements of classical methane MRV, but not all of it.
Well, Miriam, obviously Shell is a company that operates worldwide. How important is it to have collaboration and coordination between these different initiatives, both in Europe and North America and elsewhere?
I think such coordination is absolutely crucial, and I would even go beyond the various initiatives. It's about everyone, the policymakers, the regulators, the industry, other stakeholders. I think everyone has a role to play in this. Maybe I'll specifically comment on the DOE-led MMRV working group work, which is focusing on harmonizing MMRV frameworks for LNG value chains, and that goes beyond methane. Of course, it's greenhouse gas. But one of the interesting aspects of that work is the desire to align with other initiatives, other reporting frameworks in the methane space, other methodologies, and leverage what's existing, what industry has been using and is progressing on to ultimately come up with most optimum harmonized frameworks. Very important to leverage the existing work and also to involve everyone along the supply chain in this work.
Okay, we have another question that's come in from the audience. This question is from Amir Shafai. Brandon, I'll put this to you first. So the question is, what is the EU bringing to the table on the carrot side? Is You Collect, We Buy mainly about creating a framework for matching buyers with sellers and creating a market? Or is it there also as a financing element, particularly for low and middle income countries and NOCs? And I want to combine that with I think a related question that actually came in the previous panel. It was meant for Alexander, but maybe you can answer it, Brian. How do you ensure that the captured gas that is incentivized by You Collect, We Buy, how do you make sure that it's not sold to others? And I think that means others not participating in the scheme. So maybe you can take those two things together.
Yeah, those are two excellent questions. And I think I would start by saying that when we think about this initiative, I think we also need to think about aligning incentives and recognizing that not every stakeholder has exactly the same incentives. People may engage for different reasons. For some, it may be the economic impact. For some, it may be the energy security aspect. For some, it may be the climate aspect. And I think it is important, especially for the EU partners, to put themselves in the shoes of other stakeholders and other partner countries to really make sure their top priorities are being met. And it goes back to what was said previously about a lot of lower and middle income countries having increasing energy demand. That needs to be a priority, and so I don't know if we want to ensure that all of these flows are coming to Europe if they are really needed elsewhere. That's something we do go into the report, and I think that a core aspect of the initiative really does need to be this idea of mutual respect and genuine partnership to really underpin how we deal with ensuring energy security globally. In terms of the economic incentives that the EU is actually putting on the table, I think that the direct ability for the EU to somehow subsidize abated gas volumes coming into the EU, I think that is not currently on the table. And I think the reasons for that it go a little bit into the legal competences of the European Commission and what they can do, without putting legislation and getting a lot of coordination from member states. So I think we are trying to be agile in the solutions. And I think the economic incentives that we are talking about, that I spoke about in my earlier intervention, a lot of those do need to come from EU member states who are the majority shareholders on a lot of these multilateral development banks. So I'm not saying the responsibility is off of the EU and member states. There is a responsibility there, but I think we shouldn't expect it in the form of a direct grant, from the EU in the way that the World Bank is providing certain amounts of grants to help kickstart some of these projects under the GFMR. So I think, just to summarize, we need to be agile in how we think about these economic incentives. There's a lot of ways to reduce the cost, but we need to be flexible.
Yeah, let's get the World Bank perspective here. So Martin, what are your thoughts on whether You Collect, We Buy could be a financing element for low and middle income countries?
Well, I've just the point that Brandon made about economic incentives and the gas collected through a methane emission abatement scheme. I think that's to put into the consideration that some of this gas will be used in the country of origin. I think there is a moral argument to be made, but there's also an economic argument to be made, because of course to transport the gas for export purposes, be it via pipeline or even more so via LNG, comes with a significant cost element. And since many of those projects, for a number of reasons, are economically challenged, considering a local or introducing them or including them in the local supply chain probably does also come with an economic element that should be considered. Now, to the extent, the real initial part of your question, should the EU provide some sort of financial incentive to do this? From a purchasing side, as far as I understand, this is not foreseen. However, it's especially on the reporting side, or let's say on the MOV side altogether, it's a relatively it can be a relatively complex requirement for some of the producer countries, in particular in the global south. So I think where the EU's role or the Commission's role would come in, and of course we are here as well, is on the capacity building side to help those countries fulfill those sometimes relatively sophisticated reporting standards, so that the EU market remains open to them and remains an attractive outlet for their gas. So that I think is important. And in the context of MRV, I would also like to pick up on a point that Miriam from Shell mentioned before, about the DOE's MMRV system being reasonably well aligned with the EU's reporting requirements. I think it's important. This aspect of alignment is extremely important, and I think what we should avoid in the context of putting out MRV requirements is also to put out too many of them, because some of the producer countries, in particularly those located in the global south, are they're facing capacity issues on the reporting side. So having too many standards to comply with in order to be able to find outlets for their markets might just lead to inertia, because it might be too complex for them. So agreeing on a limited set of standards that are well thought through and that are and where there's a reasonable chance for compliance, I think is important. And that's a point I think that's also very relevant in this forum, because a lot of good initiatives work on a lot of good things, but it might just be too much for some of the producers to deal with.
Miriam, I'd like to get your thoughts on this as well, in terms of how you see You Collect, We Buy. Is it, in your view, something more of a framework for matching buyers with sellers, or a financing instrument that could particularly benefit low and middle income countries? You're on mute. You may still be on mute. In the meantime, while we fix that, let's go to George. So George, what are your thoughts on how to see You Collect, We Buy?
I think you can play both roles. Is if you have a credible system, then having that system enables the flow of funding into the low and middle income countries, because ultimately you need, and I think Martin was alluding to this a bit, you need transactability, and that's whether it's transactability on financing or on trading gas or implementing. You need a system that can be operationalized. And I often note that when we have these debates, there is a lot of goodwill out there on starting up systems, but ultimately this needs to survive the test of time. And that is only going to work if the companies, the governments, the buyers, the regulators, it can kind of be operationalized. So from that perspective, I think a well-designed system can definitely also be used for financing. And then secondly, whether it can connect the buyers with the sellers, with the operators. I think that does depend a bit on pricing signals. If there are no pricing signals, then it becomes purely a reporting framework from that perspective. And that is probably only going to be implemented if there is an other exogenous pressures, such as that can be regulation, for example, or that can be NGOs out there or other pressures. But if there's no price, then I don't think the system will necessarily be used after a while. And many systems have gone through this difficulty. For those of you who remember that the now very successful EU ETS scheme, for a long time it traded around zero, and that's because the supply and demand was totally mismatched for a long time. And that got corrected, luckily, and I do believe it's a very successful scheme. But markets go through these phases as well, just to put that in perspective.
Okay, so I think we have Miriam back with the sound issue fixed. So Miriam, I'll go back to you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. I think it's both. I mean, it's matching buyers with suppliers on a voluntary basis, and it's also policy mechanisms driven by the EU Commission and including some incentives. I mean, we talked about potential financial or economic incentives, but there's also the policy incentives, like I mentioned, the carbon contracts for difference, which is being applied, for example, for lower carbon and green hydrogen in various parts of the world. And the way this works is governments provide a top-up to the price of the supply contracts to cover the additional costs associated with the decarbonization of that gas. And we see this approach applied to hydrogen, and it could be an option, for example, for abated gas. So, yeah, there's many options that can be considered there.
Okay, I'm going to take another question from the audience. Brandon, I'll put this to you. It's from Anton Mifsud Bonici. Having heard about the challenges of methane, does it make sense for the EU to try to equate blue, in other words, methane-rich hydrogen with green hydrogen, no methane, as clean. So should the methane coming from such a scheme of collecting and then buying be differently labeled because it's from that source?
That's a good question. I think that the standards that we would use for assigning certain labels to hydrogen, whether green or blue, would really determine on that rigorous life cycle analysis of the full emissions of the gas, and not necessarily any sort of link to a particular project. I think we have a very rigorous understanding, a rigorous basis for what that standard would be. But that is, of course, is linked to the same MRV frameworks we were just discussing. You need to have that data, and in many cases, it may be available for these abated gas volumes, and it may be able to be proven through the certification scheme. But I don't think we would want to say that that direct link should be drawn automatically. I think the profile of those gas volumes that's used to assess applicability for any blue hydrogen standard or clean hydrogen standard should be assessed independently.
George, is this something that could be addressed through certification in terms of looking at any hydrogen that's come from this?
Yeah, I think the way we look at this is it's kind of almost irrelevant of whether the gas would be coming from abated flaring or low methane gas or hydrogen, and whether the hydrogen produced is blue, light blue, dark blue, and so on. Ultimately, what's going to count is what is the methane intensity, or in a wider context, what's the GHG content, sometimes also known as the carbon intensity. And so we are generally not that much a fan of what's sometimes called the rainbow schemes, because it puts things into boxes, but technology evolves. It's more complicated than that. And then, like Brandon is just saying, then there are the supply chain complexities, and that makes it even more complex. And so really what you actually need is a number. And then it becomes very much like, I don't know, like when you go food shopping, you want to know the calorie content, and that makes you make a certain decision. And I think it's the same for emissions, is that in our view, emissions transparency needs to be on such a level that, again, the decision makers can choose on emissions intensity, just like they choose on price or deliverability or optionality. But you need to give them that number, and that number needs to be ubiquitous, needs to be credible, and so on. And that's where registries and certification can definitely help.
Well, let's take a final question now from the audience. Martin, I'll put this question to you. So this question is from Ben Cahill. Seems that the core of You Collect, We Buy challenge is not market development, but unlocking finance for methane abatement. How is the dialogue going with banks and MDBs in terms of relaxing rules on fossil fuel exclusions and agreeing on the type of metrics and reporting required for sustainability-linked bonds?
Yeah, a good question, and certainly does not come unexpected in this forum. So what I can talk, of course, predominantly for the World Bank, and our focus so far is to work with grants as opposed to loans. So the internal dialogue, at least to my understanding, with regards to freeing up loans to finance emission abatement projects in the oil and gas space, this dialogue has either not taken place or is not mature at a level that we could discuss it here. So grants so far, contribution through capacity building, yes, but no loan-based financing in the upstream emission abatement space.
Okay, thanks, Martin. Well, we'll leave the discussion there. Thank you so much to the panelists for some really interesting insights there. I think as we move forward now and we think about next steps, of course, we have the climate summit in Baku coming up very shortly. And as we've heard today, the EU really intends to put this issue front and center. I think what's going to be key, as we've discussed particularly in the second panel, is getting that market started and whether the incentives can be put in place there to really get that market moving. And that's really going to depend on a lot of different stakeholders, as we've heard, from the EU to national governments to banks, financial institutions, the companies themselves. There's a lot of moving parts to this, as we can see. And so it's going to be really interesting to watch whether this You Collect, We Buy scheme is going to be able to be the thing that really brings this down in terms of the incentives from being perceived, at least by companies, as high-hanging fruit down to the low-hanging fruit, which we've heard from the white paper that it is. So thank you so much to all of you at home for spending a part of your afternoon here with us today to talk about this really important and really quite interesting issue. I hope you all have an excellent rest of your day, and we'll see you right back here for the next Reactive Debate. Take care.